Okay, thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. So my name is Seiichi Shimizu, Assistant Governor for International Affairs of the Bank of Japan. So it is my great honor to chair this Mayekawa lecture this morning, which is named after Governor Mayekawa, who served as the 24th governor of the Bank of Japan from 1979 to 84. It is a great pleasure to introduce Mayekawa lecturer this morning, Mr. Agustín Carstens, the General Manager of the Bank for International Settlement, or BIS. We are all excited to have Agustín at this conference. Agustín began his career in 1980 at the Bank of Mexico, and he has shown exceptional leadership and unique insight in the international financial world by combining rigorous theoretical investigation and effective practical application. He has held many distinguished positions at financial authorities and international institutions, such as Deputy Managing Director at the IMF from 2003 to 2006, and Mexico's Finance Minister from 2006 to 2009, and Governor of the Bank of Mexico from 2010 to 2017, and the General Manager of the BIS since 2017. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. As you all know, it has been announced that his term as general manager will come to an end next month. To take this opportunity, I'd like to briefly reflect on his leadership and initiatives at the BIS. In face of major changes in financial technology, the global pandemic, and the return of high inflation, Agustín's leadership during the challenging time elevated the cooperation between central banks worldwide to a new level. He has shown a strong commitment to building a modern, resilient financial architecture to empower individuals and businesses. The BIS Innovation Hub was launched in 2019, and it has served as a platform for central bank community to share insight and collaborate on innovative financial technology. The Bank of Japan has benefited from the Innovation Hub project in various ways. And his vision of the future of the financial system has been progressed significantly. Now, Agustín is going to deliver Mayekawa lecture. The lecture title is Trust and Macroeconomic Stability, a Virtuous Circle. So please join me in welcoming Agustín with a round of applause.
Well, Governor Ueda, Governor Kuroda, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to have been invited to deliver this Mayekawa lecture at the Bank of Japan. The list of past presenters includes many influential international policymakers, among them Ben Bernanke, Jean-Claude Trichet, Olivier Blanchard, and Raghu Rajan. These distinguished individuals crafted the intellectual response to many of the key economic and financial challenges of recent times. It is a privilege to join their company. For my remarks today, however, I will draw inspiration from an earlier era. This lecture is named in honor of Governor Haruo Mayekawa. Mayekawa's son was Deputy Governor of the Bank of Japan from 1974 to 79 and Governor from 79 to 84. This put him at the helm of policy making at a time marked in much of the world by financial instability, large commodity price swings, high inflation, and persistently slow productivity growth. The latter years of his tenure also saw rising tensions over global trade imbalances and exchange rate variations. Governor Mayekawa's legacy at the Bank of Japan extended beyond monetary policy. Notably, In 1982, he spearheaded the creation of IMES, reflecting the importance he placed on sound research as an input into policymaking. Since then, IMES has served as a bridge between the central bank, academia, and the public. It has also been a forum for interaction and exchange between Japanese and international economists, a role that I know Governor Mayekawa deeply valued and championed. Mayekawa-san's links with the BIS ran deep. As governor, he regularly participated in our meetings. Before that, he played a pivotal role in securing the Banks of Japan's re-entry into the BIS in 1970, making monthly visits to our Basel headquarters for several years. Today, the Bank of Japan is one of our most active members, and Governor Ueda serves on our board. The economic challenges Mayekawa-san faced as governor have renewed salience today. Thanks to the steadfast leadership, Japan navigated them more successfully than many other economies. It is natural to ask whether there are lessons we can glean from that experience. Towards the end of his tenure, Governor Mayekawa made a speech which was included in the first edition of the IMES in-house journal, Monetary and Economic Studies. In it, he laid out what he saw as the main obstacles to global economic growth and proposed measures to address them. He made 4 key points. First, persistently low growth reflected structural shortcomings. As such, demand management policies were not the answer. The only way to resolve structurally low growth is through structural reforms. Second, the best contribution that monetary policy can make to economic and financial stability is to deliver low and stable inflation. Third, high public debt and persistent fiscal deficits complicate the task of monetary policy and imperil long-term growth. For many economies, fiscal consolidation was in order. Fourth, a well-functioning world trading system is fundamental to global economic prosperity. Protectionist measures, particularly those targeting bilateral trade imbalances, hinder long-run economic development. Governor Mayekawa's policy prescriptions are as relevant today as they were 4 decades ago. I fully subscribe to them. I would like to add a 5th point to Governor Mayekawa's list, namely that earning and retaining trust is essential for public policy to be effective. To justify the importance I place on trust, let me first share some lessons learned during my career as a policymaking, which has now spanned more than 4 decades. I have had a front row seat during numerous economic and financial crises. Earlier in my career at the Banco de Mexico, I witnessed the debt crisis that struck many Latin American countries in the early 80s and the 94 tequila crisis. I was first Mexico finance minister and then central bank governor during the great financial crisis, which exploded in 2008. The COVID-19 pandemic and the aftermath took place while I was in my current role at the BIS. These crises were often a catalyst for important changes in policy frameworks. In many emerging market economies, the crisis of the 80s and 90s led to the adoption of more flexible exchange rate regimes, greater central bank independence, and an acceptance of low inflation as the main monetary policy objective. They also led to enhanced fiscal discipline and improved banking sector supervision and regulation. Some jurisdictions also undertook major structural reforms, including the liberalization of product and labor markets and privatization of public enterprises. Similarly, the GFC and the subsequent low inflation period led to an expansion of central bank policy instruments, particularly in advanced economies. This included the adoption of quantitative easing and forward guidance. The recent inflation surge has prompted further reassessments of policy frameworks. Economies have become much more integrated over the course of my career. They trade more with each other, and due to the emergence of global value chains, they trade more intensely. We felt this intensely in Mexico, particularly after the adoption of NAFTA in 1994. Today, I see this international trade integration from the vantage point of a resident of Basel, which lies at the intersection of Switzerland, France, and Germany. And it is very evident here in Asia, which is home to the world's most complex and efficient value chains. More generally, the global economy has become extremely dynamic. Information flows are unfettered, and firms and consumers increasingly sophisticated. Perhaps most importantly, financial markets have become much larger, more integrated, and faster paced than they were when I started my career. A consequence of all this is that the scope to sustain flawed policy frameworks has shrunk. Global financial markets, immense size and speed, discipline policymakers, and at times force policies to realign. To be sure, financial markets do not read everything right. They can miss important signals and remain calm in the face of rising vulnerabilities. This can be a serious problem. It is precisely in tranquil times that the seed of future distress are often sowed. But when financial markets smell weakness, they can move very quickly. To quote the late Rudiger Dornbusch, financial crises take much longer to come than you think, and then they happen much faster than you would have thought. When that happens, policymakers need to react fast, often amidst great uncertainty, and with their credibility dented, unsustainable policies disappear swiftly. What are the key lessons that I take from my experience? The first is that crises are costly and best avoided. However, while adopting sensible policy frameworks can make crises less likely, sooner or later they will occur. The second is that economies and financial markets always evolve. Policy settings and frameworks that seem appropriate today will ultimately need to change, perhaps very quickly. Thus, it is critical for policymakers to have the nimbleness and flexibility to adapt both to crisis and to the evolving economic and financial circumstances. This takes me to the core issue that I would like to address, the value of trust in policymaking. It is much easier to make the necessary changes in a dynamic and uncertain environment, the themes of today's conference, if the public trusts policymakers and their policies. But the importance of trust goes beyond enabling change. Without trust, public policies cannot succeed. Let's start with a question. What does trust refer to? Essentially, it refers to society's expectation that public authorities will act predictably in the pursuit of predefined objectives and that they will succeed in their task. Why is trust so important? If the public trusts authorities' actions, they will incorporate those actions in their own behavior. This makes it more likely that the authorities will achieve their objectives. Moreover, if the public trusts public policies, they will be more willing to accept measures that call for short-term costs but deliver long-term benefits. Trust underpins the effectiveness and legitimacy of policies. Policymakers acquire trust by achieving their objectives over time. hence the importance of setting clear goals which provide a benchmark against which to evaluate policies and assess their success. But setting targets alone is not enough. Policymakers must also pursue them decisively, particularly when circumstances change. There is a positive feedback loop in the dynamics of trust. Effective and legitimate policies make it easier for the authorities to achieve their objectives. This in turn builds trust, producing a virtuous cycle. However, this dynamic can also work in the other direction, and at times very quickly. In the extreme, if trust evaporates, the capacity to make effective public policies disappears. Preserving credibility is a constant challenge. It requires consistency in public policies over time. Institutional arrangements, like independent central banks, can support this purpose. To establish, preserve, and enhance macrofinancial stability, it is essential for the public to trust all of the key macro policy dimensions: monetary, fiscal, and financial policies, individually and as a group. This requires coherence between them. Let me elaborate. I will begin with the most fundamental aspect of central banking, the nature of money. The social convention of money is based on the trust placed in it by the public. As money is the basis for the entire financial system, the system's stability ultimately rests on the trust. Fiat money has no intrinsic value. Its worth derives from the social convention that underpins it and from the institution that allows it to function, the central bank. Money only has value if people expect the others will honor that value today and in the future. That is why the issuer of money is so powerful. This power comes with great responsibility. Those who abuse their ability to issue currency deprive money of its value and forfeit the trust of the public. The consequences of losing trust in money can be disastrous. This can range from high inflation and sharp exchange rate depreciations to the substitution of the national currency with a foreign one. In the extreme, for example, in hyperinflationary episodes, there could even be a return to barter. Such events typically go hand in hand with financial instability, sharply lower economic growth, widespread job losses, and soaring inequality. Central bank autonomy emerged to prevent such developments. After all, autonomous central banks are institutions within the state vested with a mandate to act in the public interest and preserve the purchasing power of the national currency. Their autonomy is the social engineering that solidifies society trust in money. In recent decades, many central banks have adopted monetary arrangements that allow them to anchor expectations and preserve money's purchasing power. Inflation targeting regimes are the most common framework to ensure this. But what does inflation targeting consist of? Central banks do not control inflation directly, but their policy tools can influence it. By adopting an inflation target, a central bank commits to use its tools to achieve that target. If the public trusts the central bank, then the inflation target, rather than current inflation, becomes a key reference point for price and wage decisions. This contributes to low and stable inflation. Inflationary episodes are usually short-lived, reflecting changes in relative prices. Inflation becomes self-equilibrating and ceases to materially influence the behavior of households and businesses. That is why the inflation outbreak that followed the COVID pandemic in many countries was so concerning. The trust central banks had gained over many years could have been lost if society had started to doubt their commitment to price stability. some generations experienced the risk of the economy transitioning to higher inflation regime for the first time. Once the transition starts, it can be very hard to stop. Faced with this risk, it was necessary and appropriate for central banks to tighten policy forcefully and restore price stability. The value of doing so is reflected in the relatively modest impact on output and employment, compared with the significant cost incurred during the 70s and 80s, when many central banks responded slowly to rising inflation and expectations de-anchored. But it is well known that the money issued by the central bank, known as primary money, is not the only money that circulates in modern economy. Households and businesses rely instead on commercial bank money in the form of bank deposits and credits for the bulk of their day-to-day transactions. It is thus essential that trust in money extend to commercial bank money. At the same time, primary and commercial bank money are indistinguishable for most people. That is by design. Over time, institutional arrangements have evolved to extend society's trust in primary money to commercial bank money within a two-tiered monetary system. The cornerstone of that system is that interbank payments ultimately settle on the central bank's balance sheet through the exchange of primary money between commercial banks. This guarantees the finality of payments and the singleness of commercial bank money. The central bank's ability to create liquidity by lending to the banking system makes ultimate settlements of the banking system in the central bank possible. At times of great instability, the central bank can also provide liquidity through its lender of last resort function. In doing so, it safeguards public trust in the entire monetary system. The value of the two-tier monetary system is particularly evident when contrasted with recent attempts to issue private forms of money through technologies based on decentralized ledgers. These alleged forms of money operate without central bank intervention, a lender of last resort, or a robust regulatory and supervisory framework. They have led to the proliferation of so-called cryptocurrencies, which cannot guarantee payment finality or maintain stable value, and so clearly lack the essential characteristics of money. In addition, the absence of regulation to guard against money laundering or counter-terrorist financing means that these assets are widely used for illicit purposes. These developments highlight the critical point that the value of fiat money lies in the institutional framework and social conventions that support it. The mere existence of a two-tier monetary system is not enough to guarantee trust. The banking system must also remain solvent. Strong, safe, and solvent banks help to support the economy. Because banking crises have large social costs, the system requires adequate regulation and supervision. A complement is deposit insurance, which exists to forestall potential bank runs. Together, these layers of protection safeguard the public savings and foster trust in both primary and commercial bank money. Banks have become much more resilient since the GFC. Society reaped the benefits in the COVID pandemic, as banks played a vital role in keeping economies and business afloat, helping to support jobs. Even during the banking crisis, a banking stress of 2023, the post-GFC reforms, combined with authorities' swift deployment of crisis management tools, limited the fallout to only a handful of institutions. Nonetheless, more should be done to bolster the banking sector's resilience. Make no mistake, the core responsibility lies with banks themselves. There is no substitute for sound business models, strong risk management, and effective governance. But in order to keep them on a sound footing in a more volatile and dynamic financial system, banking supervision must continue to up its game to identify and remedy problems at banks proactively. and timely, full, and consistent implementation of banking reforms and regulations, including Basel III, remains essential. The non-bank financial system has grown rapidly in recent decades. This sector comprises many activities involving securities, including debt instruments, and broader forms of intermediation performed by insurance companies, private credit, investment services companies, and hedge funds. In many jurisdictions, non-bank financial intermediation has for some time now accounted for over half of its financial system. Recent episodes of extreme instability have highlighted the need for greater supervision and regulation of the non-bank sector. One reason is to prevent harmful arbitrage between regulated and unregulated financial activities. Moreover, the sector's links to the traditional banking system and the tendency of non-bank intermediation to generate opaque and excessive leverage and liquidity mismatches can pose systemic risks. In recent years, some central banks have had to act as market makers of last resort to diffuse crises which threaten to spill over into the wider system. In doing so, they upheld trust in the broader financial system. Because such interventions may conflict with measures to preserve price stability, greater regulation and supervision of the non-bank financial sector are called for. Let me now turn to the fiscal dimension. Within the universe of debt instruments, public debt is of particular importance. If used appropriately, public debt allows governments to successfully function. But from a macro financial point of view, it is important that any public debt is and is seen to be sustainable. Investors must trust the government to meet its financial obligations without resort to central bank financing. Public debt plays a strategic role. As the instrument with the lowest credit risk, it is essential for grounding the risk of asset portfolios, particularly those of banks. Furthermore, public debt serves as the main reference for valuing other forms of debt, such as corporate debt. Hence, defaults on public debt can destabilize the whole financial system. They also threaten monetary stability, since the central bank, even if it's formally autonomous, may be compelled to finance debt service with primary issuance, leading to fiscal dominance over monetary policy. The result would be rising inflation and sharp exchange rate depreciations. In the light of these considerations, it is essential for fiscal authorities to curb the relentless rise in public debt. The low interest rate environment that followed the GFC flattered fiscal accounts. Large deficits and high debt seemed sustainable, allowing fiscal authorities to avoid hard choices. But the days of ultra-low rates seem to be over. Fiscal authorities have a narrow window to put their house in order before the public's trust in their commitments starts to fray. Markets are already waking up to the fact that some paths are not sustainable. As I mentioned before, financial markets can remain calm in the face of large imbalances until suddenly, one day, they no longer are. That is why fiscal consolidation in many economies need to start now. Mothering through is not enough. In many countries, current policies imply steadily rising public debt in the coming decades. Pressures for more public spending will only increase, not least due to the population aging, climate change, and in many jurisdictions, higher defense spending. Fiscal authorities must provide a transparent and credible path to safeguard fiscal solvency, ideally underpinned by strong fiscal frameworks. They must then follow through on their commitments. Central banks cannot be the only game in town. Trust in the various aspects of macroeconomic policy, monetary, financial stability, and fiscal, is closely interrelated. Monetary instability imperils financial stability, erodes investors' willingness to hold public debt, and hammers public confidence. Financial crises have large fiscal costs, and loss of confidence in public finances compromises the stability of the whole financial system and can undermine price stability. All of this ultimately costs people in terms of lost opportunities, jobs, and social and public benefits. Thus, it is essential to prevent trust in all pillars of a country's macro-financial frameworks and to ensure consistency between them. This represents a great challenge due to the involvement of multiple authorities and the existence of unavoidable political motivations, particularly in fiscal policy. While this is not an insurmountable issue, it highlights the value of coordination among the various arms of public policy. Let me add a further reflection on the credibility of fiscal and monetary policy today, one that echoes the prescription of Governor Mayekawa 4 decades ago. Recent experiences should prompt reflection on the appropriate role of monetary and fiscal policy and greater realism about what can they deliver. Fostering unattainable expectations about policymakers' ability to smooth out every economic pothole will ultimately lower trust in public policies. For monetary policy, it would be prudent to avoid excessive fine-tuning. Central banks should not be expected to stabilize inflation at very short horizons and within narrow ranges. This is particularly important because, as recent events have shown, inflation will partly depend on factors that are not under central bank's control. Fiscal policy should seek to allocate scarce resources to measures that can raise future growth. This can include investment in areas such as infrastructure, education, and health systems. Nonetheless, we must remember that structural reforms are the best tool to sustainably increase a country's growth potential. As a final remark, I would like to stress the importance of predictability in building and sustaining public trust. Predictability does not mean inertia. When circumstances change or when frameworks are clearly flawed, policies must adapt. However, the public has a right to expect a degree of continuity and transparency about basic policy objectives, their development, and the procedures for guiding any shifts in course. All this comes to mind when we think of contemporaneous trade policy. Let me conclude. Policymakers have faced frequent and intense challenges in recent decades. In the face of extraordinary strains, they strive to preserve the value of money and keep their economies and the financial system functioning. Their success illustrated the importance of maintaining public trust, which was a prerequisite for their decisive actions. And policies worked better when they were each part of a coherent whole. If the events of the 21st century so far are a guide, we should not expect plain sailing in the coming decades. Building resilience will require policymakers to apply an appropriate policy mix and communicate it effectively. I would like to leave you with this last thought. Part of preserving trust is to know the limits of what policies can deliver. Expecting policymakers to deploy extraordinary macroeconomic policies to respond to every challenge is a sure way to erode the public trust. Building resilient and robust economies and financial systems is the best way to ensure that policies remain effective so that they can be deployed when they are needed the most. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Agustín, for your very insightful remarks. And also you highlight and elaborate the importance of trust in macroeconomic policy. So now we have sufficient and very lots of time for the Q&A session. So I'd like to use the rest of time for the Q&A session with our follower. So first, I'd like to collect the question and comments from the participants, and then I'd like to will ask Agustín to reply to them. And so, Professor, I will repeat some of the several rounds of this exercise. And so, if you have a question, so please indicate by the stand your nameplate. Okay. So, let's see any question. Okay. Yes, I see the first Athanasios, please. So, Professor Orfanes, please.
Agustín, what a pleasure to listen to you give us this tour de force. Specific question referring to the question you asked, what does trust refer to? I think it's very important, as you pointed out, I'm quoting, it refers to society's expectation that public authorities will act predictably in the pursuit of predefined objectives. And the question is, even though this is fantastic advice, a concern I and many others have when we observe central bank behavior around the world is that discretion is often preferred over systematic policy, which undermines the very definition of what trust is about. What is your advice about how to address this challenge and convince central banks to be more systematic than they have been in the past?
Yes, so let's see any question first. Okay, so if no, so please reply. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anastasios. You always ask the tough questions. You hear me? Hello, hello? Yes. Thank you very much, Anastasios. You always ask the tough questions. At the end of the day, I mean, as I mentioned, conditions change. And I would say most of the monetary policy frameworks should give us a strong platform of predictability. And most of the times it should be followed. Now, I tend to agree with a little bit of the hint in your question that discretion should be avoided as much as possible. But then there are circumstances to change. And that's why communication is very important. And I think if central banks use discretionary, not as a rule, but as a complement to a solid monetary policy framework, it should be accompanied by detailed explanations and more than anything linking it to the final objective. Basically, you should say, I need to do this fine-tuning here and there because these are the circumstances, and to comply my objectives, I believe that this is important. I think a very intense dialogue is relevant. And then also you should evaluate your policy measures. If you deviated or if you had to correct or you had to do something extraordinary, you should eventually say, did it work, did it not work, and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't think that there is a mechanistic way to deal with your question. Again, I also don't think it's feasible to completely commit yourself to a very inflexible regime. You need to fine-tune, but then you have to explain and link it to your final objective.
Okay, thank you very much. And were any other comments and questions from the floor?
There's one in the back.
Yes. Yes, please do
that. It's Roshuji from Chuo University. Thank you for great talk today. So my question is how to contain public's ballooning expectation toward the central banks. So during the period of unconventional monetary policies, central banks needed to be very creative in devising new tools to fight financial crises and also deflationary pressures. So they started purchasing all sorts of unconventional assets. And that sort of expanded the toolbox of monetary policy on the one hand, but on the other hand, people started saying that, oh, if you're allowed to buy this asset, you can surely buy that asset as well. So that kind of started the process of ballooning expectations to the central banks and some pressures to expand the mandate of central banking. So now that that period is over, how can we kind of contain the ballooning expectation, go back to the previous track of the conventional, more normal monetary policy? That's my question. Thank you.
Yes, this is a very this is a very important question. I mean, it has to do with evaluation of policy instruments, and sometimes we need to have far more time to really evaluate the full impact of certain policies. I mean, I personally think, for example, quantitative easing, we still don't have enough horizon to fully evaluate the impact of quantitative easing. It has to be done in a professional way. I mean, certainly the central banks act based on their mandate and the circumstances they perceive. I think that a lot of policy making during last decade and even before was affected by the GFC and by the perception that inflation was very low for structural reasons, and that gave you sufficient degrees of freedom to probably embark in a more aggressive monetary policy making. I think now we sort of start seeing that that might not have been the best to do. And that's why I think that some form of evaluation is important. And again, I also think that starting in the GFC, there was this situation where the central bank was perceived as the only game in town. In the short term, it is true that the central bank is the only game in town. But then it might, and this is just a speculation on my part for all of you to think, we might have been too good at that, and so that we raised the expectations of a society that we could do many things without harm. And I think that we probably do not have all the degrees of freedom that we would like to have. So I think that a little bit more of prudence, a little bit more of drawing the line of how much can you do and how much you cannot do is important. I mean, I was part of government. I was Minister of Finance, and I was very happy for the central bank to do many things for me. And if I could get away with it, that I would be very, very happy. To have a strong central bank and force you to take tough actions, sometimes it's better. I think it's better. So, you know, this is not only a technical issue, it's a political issue, it's a political economy issue, but I think that central banks should draw a line at some point and not be the only game in town.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I have another question. The first, so Professor Goldinenchenko, please.
Thank you for the excellent speech and remarks. I have one quick question. At least for some countries represented here in this room, we see more and more political pressure on the central bank's signs of fiscal dominance. I was wondering if you can comment on how you can maintain and defend trust in central banks in this kind of environment. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, again, there is no one size fits all. But to help answer and provide light into this issue, we need to realize one key issue, that if you have an independent central bank that never, through its history, had some friction with the central government, that means that the independence was not necessary. I mean, I think that the independence is created there to limit some policies. Very directly, the use of primary issuance. But then everything can get so convoluted that you can be very close to primary issuance and still be supporting the government. I think at some point the central bank has to face the need to have friction with the government. Friction is not bad, it's unpleasant. But you know, the friction and the period of friction you go through is the ones that usually reinforces more your credibility. I mean, you are there precisely to put a strong leg when the government wants to do something that is probably not for the best of society. Now, there are different representations, there are different political environments, there are different degrees of freedom, you know. But my sense, at least when I was governor, is not to shy away from having some disputes. Now, of course, there are some countries where this is unquestionable. You cannot do this. But you have to be mindful that part of your job is precisely to generate that friction when the right time comes. So that's my reflection on the issue.
Okay, thank you. So we have probably Iwata-san and also Kaizuka-san in the back seat. Yes, the first, Iwata-san, please first.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I have one question. We now observe the emergence and development of cryptocurrencies. And what is impressive for me is that President Trump wants to establish the United States as a superpower country of cryptocurrencies. But at the same time, he mentioned that he prohibited the issue of central bank digital currency. And I was wondering, in the absence of the central bank digital currency, in the cryptocurrency world, only the private money issuers are there, and Bitcoin and the stable coin. In the absence of this central bank digital currency, whether it's possible to maintain the stability, monetary stability, and also the flexible management of monetary policy. So my question is, anyway, the implication of this private cryptocurrencies on the management of monetary policy, notably the role of central bank digital currency. How about the position of BIS?
Okay. Or
no, let me, although here are people that have better, better John and Chris and others have can give a more authoritative answer, but let me give you my perception. As far as I can understand, the way this executive order is being interpreted is that the CBDC that should not be contemplated is at the retail level. And I think, you know, any type of prohibition of that sort is not necessarily the best, but I think for the architecture of the of the future financial system, what is key is to have wholesale CBDC, because that would allow it to combine with tokenized commercial bank money, and they can use programmability, composability, automatic settlements, and so on and so forth. And I think that area is safe. no? Now, the issue of cryptocurrencies, as long as they are a vehicle to invest or to speculate, that's fine. Although I don't think that they really fulfill the role of money, you know. For example, they cannot guarantee the singleness of money. They don't guarantee finality. And through history, we have seen many episodes where private money proliferated and eventually they disappeared. And precisely to resolve those problems, central banks were created, you know. So, I mean, I think that as long as these become issues that are isolated and do not weaken dramatically the traditional financial system, the two-tier financial system, it would be fine. It would be a distraction, an unnecessary distraction. It can generate social costs, but you know, it should be livable, you know. If more restrictions or more disadvantages are mounted on central bank money, I think that would be unadvisable. And at some point, that could threaten the independence of the central bank. So I think that's something it should be kept in mind.
Okay, and Kaizuka-san, please.
Thank you, Chairman. And personally, I'm very happy to be back in this meeting room because up until last year, I was sitting on that side as one of the organizers of this conference. So today, I'm here sitting in a very relaxed mood. And I'm happy to raise two questions. Mr. Carstens, you mentioned about trust, and especially you mentioned about trust on the fiscal policy side. And you used to be on the monetary side, and also you are in the fiscal side too. So my question is related to the how to secure the trust in the fiscal policy formulation. There was some discussion, even in Japan, whether we should have independent fiscal institutions which could provide information, provide a scenario of a fiscal scenario, or monitor the fiscal situation. And also whether there should be some hard fiscal rule. Looking at the situation in Europe, there is some pros and cons and the existence hard of a fiscal rule. So in this particular juncture, what is your particular advice to secure the trust in the fiscal policy formulation, either necessity of independent fiscal institution or necessity of a hard fiscal rule? This is my first question. The second question is related to the coordination between the central bank and the fiscal authority. Now, the Bank of Japan is one of the central banks which started the quantitative tightening. So in this particular situation, how the coordination should be between the public debt management and monetary policy formulation, especially the policy on reducing the purchasing amount of the debt instrument. So this is my two questions related to the fiscal policy formulation. Thank you.
Well, with respect to your first question, I used the term in my speech of the central bank independence is the social engineering solution to the problem of safeguarding the issuance of money from fiscal authorities. And I think this type of social political engineering should also in some way should be applied to fiscal policies. I'm not talking about independence, because independence of what? If you think of the fiscal authority, they would be independent of what? I mean, probably independence of the will of the president or the ruler, but that's very difficult to articulate. But I think some form of autonomous entity that can evaluate fiscal policies and can make an unbiased assessment of the consequences of fiscal policy would be appropriate, you know. I mean, in the UK, for example, I think that you have this type of construct. You know, in different parts of the world, this exists, and I think they play an important role. In some parts of the world, the central bank plays this role. I mean, I can say in the case of Mexico, we were very explicit about the consequences of fiscal policy. Among other things, because if they were going to generate inflation, we would want to make it clear that it's not because of us, but it was because of the public authority. And if interest rates had to go up, it was not because of arbitrariness, of dogmatism of the central bank, but because we need to respond to the conditions. So some form, again, I would call it social political engineering could be adequate, at least to start a dialogue in society on how expansive or not fiscal policy should be. And coordination, again, is one size does not fit all. I mean, again, I can give you the example of Mexico. Now, this doesn't mean that this is it should be followed. In Mexico, our modern regime comes from having disastrous scenarios where there was no credibility on our currency, on our government, on the central bank. So we had the chance to rebuild it almost from zero. Today, there is very close coordination between the central bank and the Minister of Finance, but it's only in terms of dialogue. There are prearranged meetings, and there is a lot of openness in the public dialogue among the two policies, and it works really well. Now, I don't necessarily think that this is possible in every single country, but what you cannot deny is that fiscal and monetary policies are tied by the hip. You cannot pretend that one thing doesn't have anything to do with the other. So you have to find a way, how do you deal with that circumstance? Because eventually you will be forced to act or to comment or to reflect on the issue. It's a difficult balance, I have to say, but you have to look for it.
Thank you. And we have Pierre-Olivier, please.
Yes, thank you, Agustín. This was a really excellent lecture. I want to come back to the issue of central bank and central bank mandates. I mean, certainly central bank independence has been one of the greatest success stories of the last 50 years, delivering stable inflation for advanced economies, but perhaps even more so for emerging markets. And in fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that the resilience of emerging markets in the last 5 years or so owes to improved mandates, especially on monetary policy. But inflation and price stability is only one of the mandates for many central banks. Financial stability is another one. So in a sense, monetary and fiscal policy may be tied at the hip, but monetary and financial stability policies are also tied at the hip, and sometimes even within the mandates of the central banks. And issues of trust and communication can become complicated when there is a tension between the monetary policy or price stability objectives and the financial stability objectives. So for instance, you can think of periods where interest rates will remain very low. Maybe that's necessary for a monetary policy perspective side, but maybe that creates financial risks. Or you can think of periods where your central banks are raising interest rates to bring back price stability, but that could create financial instability in the banking sector that is not necessarily hedged for interest rate risk. So the way central banks try to deal with this is with the separation principle. So they try to keep this Chinese wall between the price stability objectives and the financial stability objectives and have different instruments for dealing with one or the other. It maybe we can aim for this ex ante, but in practice, ex post, it can be difficult. There can be limits on what you can do with various types of instruments. And I was sort of curious to hear your views on this, whether you think the separation principle is a useful guide, and whether we should adhere to it in all times and circumstances. And if we don't, then does it create issues in terms of trust and clarity on the objectives of central banks? Thank you.
Well, that, needless to say, that's precise what you said. I mean, there is an unresolved tension there. And yes, there is a possibility that one action can be interpreted as weakening your commitment to your main objective. As a matter of fact, in hyperinflationary or in countries with huge banking crisis, one way to solve the banking crisis had been by diluting nominal assets, you know. I mean, by destroying the banking system through inflation, you can solve a banking crisis. Namely, Argentina has done this more than once, you know. But obviously, that's a situation you want to avoid. So in this sense, I think central banks have to be very demanding on their expectations on how financial regulation and supervision should be conducted, either by them or third parties. And then, as much as possible, you should try to delineate or identify or reference your different policy responses to particular objectives. I think what the Bank of England has done recently, you know, in the case of the how is it, the LID or when you had this problem with insurance companies, you tried to do you had a very particular intervention in the gilt market, and it was just focused towards that problem. And it was said this is temporary and this should not affect the conduction of monetary policy. And it was very successful, you know. Now, if it's a major crisis, that ring fencing becomes impossible, no? I mean, the best is to avoid the circumstances. The second best is to hope that the problem is not so deep that it really contaminates. And the third is that, you know, it contaminates. And then what would be important is also to bring on board the fiscal authorities. I mean, at some point you have to say, well, this will not be solved through liquefying the whole system, and it will be absorbed through fiscal means. So that's why I think that the joint consideration of all the policies are important, because when push comes to shove, everything comes at play at the same time.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, please, Raven.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, at the ECB, the Governing Council receives every quarter a very detailed presentation with financial stability, monetary policy trade-offs, exactly along the line that you were referring to, Pierre-Olivier. We can talk about it more in the break. Thank you for the very insightful lecture. I had a question on the medium-term orientation that is so important. And I think it's fair to say, if we would ask every governor in the room what they have in mind with a medium-term perspective, we get different answers. And so I wanted to ask your advice as to how, sort of in practice, one keeps a focus on this medium-term orientation, which is so important for building trust, away from the more short-term perspective.
I think it's very important for the central bank to articulate its medium-term vision, and that articulation should be a sort of a reference point for your policy actions. and if conditions merit to adjust. It has to be sufficiently long-term that it allows for fluctuations and it allows for small deviations, but it should not be that long that becomes too comfortable for the central bank. So the definition of what medium terms mean is very, very relevant, you know. I mean, I think looking what Governor Ueda presented us, medium term in Japan might be much longer than what medium term for Mexico is, you know. I think that in some countries, some variables are slow-moving variables. In others, they are extremely volatile. So you have to calibrate to your circumstances and also to the effectiveness of your policies. But I still think that the medium term is important to articulate it and to present it as part of your guidance in your policy making.
Okay, then so Andrew, please.
Thank you. You talked about the importance of trust for central banks, but trust is important for all manner of, you know, entities in society, government, the law, press, companies, and many of them, at least in the Anglo-Saxon countries, have been suffering this kind of persistent reduction in trust over the past decade or two. In some sense, therefore, we might find the sort of tide lapping at our feet a little bit in terms of that trend. Are we really insulated from that social trend of declining trust? And if we're not, what more would you say as you kind of leave your role that we need to do to protect ourselves? There's a theme in your speech of keep doing excellently what you've always done and think about how we change, but primarily stick to the core, if I understand it correctly. But is that enough? What would you recommend that we keep in mind if this general trend of reducing trust starts to affect us as well?
Well, I think the complement in my speech to that message is don't try to be the only game in town. I think that in the last 20 years or 30 years, we have tended to believe that monetary and fiscal policy are very effective to stabilizing and influencing growth, and we have seen that that is not the case. And I even think that the limits of those policies are more immediate. I mean, with monetary policy, for example, we just came out of a very, very challenging period of high inflation, you know, that we resolved it adequately. But I don't think that the degrees of freedom we thought we have them today. So I think that should limit a little bit more in the sense of Athanasius' question. We should limit more our proactiveness, especially when pursuing non-inflation objectives. For me, I think that this is a key issue. I think if we reflect in the last 10, 20 years, something that we don't understand very well is supply side. And a lot of the inflation that we have been experiencing has to do also with supply side shocks. I think we have concentrated too much in policy instruments that act through the aggregate demand side, that is fiscal and monetary. At this stage, I feel that we have hit our limit there, and now we have to work more for growth and on employment on the aggregate supply side. There is where we need to be more nimble. There is where production should be more effective. And that's why, for example, one of the reasons why I'm also very concerned about the trade policy that is being implemented, because at the end of the day, it will reduce the flexibility of the world economy. You know, I mean, a huge windfall gain we all had as central banks was when China was incorporated into the World Trade System. You know, it was a huge additional supply of labor. It was a huge, it increased huge flexibility to aggregate supply. Now, yes, that generated some problems of unemployment, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue this. The negative manifestations of China coming into the World Trade System should have been taken care through other policies that the governments have. No, for me now to start the other way around, you know, let's make aggregate supply more rigid. It will mean that we will face probably more volatile inflation, and that we will have probably more pressures to use stabilization policies, which is something I don't particularly look forward to.
Okay, thank you, Agustín. Is there any further comment and question? Okay, so I think it's almost a time to close the session, but again, thank you very much. And also, this session, I believe this session provides a very good foundation for further discussion at today and tomorrow's conference now. So please join me in thanking Agustín with another round of applause. Thank you very much.